Jhumpa Lahiri's short story, Mrs. Sen's, from her collection Interpreter of Maladies, explores themes of cultural displacement, loneliness, and the struggle for identity in an unfamiliar environment. The story begins by introducing Mrs. Sen, a middle-aged Indian woman living in the United States with her husband, who is a university professor. Mrs. Sen is responsible for taking care of Elliot, an 11-year-old boy, after school. Elliot's mother, who is divorced, leaves him with Mrs. Sen while she works. Through Elliot's observations, we see Mrs. Sen's world, which is filled with reminders of the life she left behind in India. The apartment she shares with her husband is decorated with Indian artifacts, and Mrs. Sen often wears traditional Indian clothing, signaling her deep connection to her roots. Mrs. Sen's sense of displacement is evident from the outset. She struggles to adapt to life in America, finding comfort only in the memories of her homeland. The unfamiliarity of her surroundings, combined with her limited English proficiency, isolates her from the world outside her apartment. She feels out of place in American culture, which is alien to her in many ways. This sense of isolation is compounded by her husband's immersion in his academic work, leaving her alone to grapple with the challenges of adaptation. Food plays a central role in the story, serving as a tangible connection to Mrs. Sen's past life in India. She spends much of her time preparing traditional Indian dishes, which require specific ingredients that are difficult to find in America. The act of cooking becomes a ritual that provides her with a sense of purpose and a link to her cultural identity. Elliot is fascinated by the elaborate process of food preparation, which is very different from the simple meals his mother makes. Through food, Lahiri illustrates Mrs. Sen's attempts to preserve her culture and maintain a sense of normalcy in a foreign land. Mrs. Sen longs for the sense of community and connection that she enjoyed in India. She frequently talks about how in India, any gathering of people is an occasion for celebration, and how she could step out of her home at any time and be surrounded by friends and family. This contrasts sharply with her life in America, where she feels isolated and disconnected. The only connection she has to her homeland is through letters and phone calls, which do little to alleviate her loneliness. Elliot becomes a substitute for the community she misses, though he cannot fully understand her longing. The relationship between Mrs. Sen and Elliot is central to the story. Elliot, who is also somewhat isolated due to his mother's busy schedule and his parents' divorce, finds a kindred spirit in Mrs. Senator. He is drawn to her warmth and the sense of care she provides, which contrasts with the emotional distance he feels from his own mother. However, their relationship is marked by a fundamental cultural and generational gap. While Elliot is intrigued by Mrs. Sen's stories and customs, he cannot fully grasp the depth of her homesickness or her struggles to adapt to a new culture. One of the most poignant symbols in the story is Mrs. Sen's struggle to learn how to drive. Her inability to drive in America symbolizes her broader difficulty in navigating this new world. She views driving as a terrifying and insurmountable challenge, much like her attempts to adapt to American life. Despite her husband's encouragement, Mrs. Sen is unable to overcome her fear, which further isolates her by limiting her mobility. Her reliance on her husband for transportation reflects her broader dependence on him as her link to the outside world, exacerbating her sense of entrapment. The climax of the story occurs when Mrs. Sen finally takes the car out on her own with Elliot as her passenger. Her desperation to maintain some semblance of independence and control leads her to attempt driving alone, despite her fear. The inevitable happens: she gets into a minor car accident. This incident is a turning point in the story, highlighting the dangers of her isolation and her inability to fully integrate into American society. The car accident also symbolizes the collision between her old life and the new world she is trying to navigate. Elliot's mother is portrayed as the antithesis of Mrs. Senator. She is independent, self-sufficient, and fully adapted to American life. Her interactions with Elliot are practical and devoid of the warmth and attention that Mrs. Sen provides. The contrast between the two women highlights the cultural and emotional differences that define their lives. While Mrs. Sen clings to her past and struggles with adaptation, Elliot's mother embodies the American ideal of independence and self-reliance. However, this independence comes at the cost of emotional distance from her son. The story is imbued with a sense of loss of homeland, loss of identity, and loss of connection. Mrs. Sen's entire existence in America is marked by a profound sense of grief for the life she left behind. Her attempts to recreate a piece of her past in her new environment are ultimately unsuccessful, as she cannot replicate the community and culture she once had. This theme of loss is mirrored in Elliot's experience, as he loses the comfort and attention of Mrs. Senator after the car accident, when his mother decides to take him to another after-school program. In the end, Mrs. Sens paints a poignant picture of the immigrant experience, highlighting the deep emotional toll that displacement takes on individuals. Mrs. Sen's inability to adapt to her new environment and her overwhelming homesickness illustrate the complexities of cultural assimilation and the challenges of maintaining one's identity in a foreign land. Lahiri's story is a powerful exploration of the loneliness and isolation that often accompany the immigrant experience, as well as the small, everyday struggles that define it. Mrs. Sen's story ends on a note of resignation, as she remains trapped between two worlds, unable to fully belong to either.